Well, welcome everybody. This is the Reddit r/ADHD interview with Dr. Russell Barkley, who's here with us today. Thank you so much, Dr. Barkley, for coming.
My pleasure. Thanks so much, Scott. I appreciate it. You too, Stephanie.
Yeah, and I'm Scott. This is Stephanie, my sister there. And just to give you a bit of an introduction to Dr. Barkley, if you are unfamiliar with him, he shows up on the subreddit every so often through his videos and his books, which we'll talk about in a moment. But he spent decades and decades studying ADHD, particularly those in children and adolescents, but of course, adults as well. So no matter, I guess, who you are, what age you are, when you're listening, Dr. Barkley has done extensive work and knows a great deal about your situation. And we're excited to talk about that today. So I wanted to give a bit of a talk. We could review all of his important things, I guess. I mean, the thing that really shocked me was like you received like $7 million in grant funding for your science over the years, which was just insane. You were the president of the clinical child psychology section of the American Psychological Association. And if you're not sure, that's a really big deal for those of us who are less in the know. And he just travels around giving invited lectures and teaching mainly parents and adults, really kind of acting as a translator for research that can be quite complicated. And in fact, we had a question where somebody was like, how do I trust it? How do I know? People like Dr. Barkley bridge that gap, and they help you kind of siphoning out all of this stuff, because all kinds of research can happen, and then really distilling it down into these really, really important things that you need to know. And he actually places those things in books. We have this one. Is it reversed? Oh man, that's why you should reverse the screen. But anyway, Taking Charge of Adult ADHD. I obviously have this myself, and it's so useful, so useful. Like no matter what stage you're at. So Stephanie and I have been diagnosed, of course, and the latter half of the book was extremely useful to me personally. But it's just like, if you think you have ADHD and what should you do, and I don't know, and if you're struggling, the book covers all of those things. And Dr. Barkley also has a few other books. One that my wife felt compelled to buy, which is When an Adult You Love Has ADHD, What Do You Do? But he also has like Principles for Raising a Child, Managing ADHD in School. Oh, and I actually have, I'd forgotten in our discussion prior to this, Dr. Barkley, there was a really good question about teaching children with ADHD in the pandemic, right? Over video like this. Yeah. We can't be physically there, and you're kind of less real to their brains. That was really fascinating. Sure. There's a book that I very much like, Executive Functions, What They Are, How They Work, and Why They Evolved. That one.
Oh, that's a tough one. Yeah.
It's my favorite one. Yeah. That one's like really just kind of blew the lid off. So I'll stop yammering quite so much, but suffice to say, if you have questions about how ADHD works, do one of two things. A, Google his books. B, Google the YouTube videos of his lectures. Those lectures in particular just completely, like honestly changed my life. Like they really, really did.
Mine as well. They were revolutionary in helping me understand myself and how my disorder manifests in my life.
Like what is actually going on, and the fact that ADHD is kind of a misnomer, because this may just be me, because ADHD is well, of course it isn't, but it's a very complex disorder. But Dr. Barkley's framing of ADHD matched my experience completely, whereas what I had previously been seeing out in the world did not, and that made me doubt my diagnosis a bit. But we'll talk about that a little while. So that was a large amount of words. So thank you so much for sticking with me with that. And then I guess we can just jump into it. But before we do, Dr. Barkley, could you tell us a little bit about the books that you have coming out now, that you have some new stuff happening?
I'd be glad to. Thank you, Scott. I appreciate that. In case you don't know, by the way, I'm in Richmond, Virginia, and I teach at the psychiatry department at VCU Medical Center, just so you know my current affiliation. But I'm also a grandfather, which is why I'm here with my wonderful grandchildren and two others up in Connecticut. But that said, Scott, thanks for mentioning the books. I do want to mention that the Taking Charge of Adult ADHD has just been updated. It is in production. It will be out this summer. And so I encourage people not to buy the old copy, which is 10 years old. But instead, if you haven't read it, you can find it at a library, or maybe a friend has it. But please save your money and don't get the dated one, although it's still good. But the updated one is much, much better. There's been 10,000 research papers in the past decade alone on ADHD, and all of that had to get woven into the update. In addition to that, Scott, you so kindly mentioned, as did Stephanie, my When an Adult You Love Has ADHD, but I also have, my latest book is for parents. It's 12 principles for raising a child with ADHD, though every one of the principles would apply to an adult as well. So some adults are writing me saying that I should do it again for in an adult focused format. So maybe we will. But that's kind of my book. I don't want to call it my parting shot because I'm not done writing, but the what I did was over a year ago, I sat down and said, I'm coming to the end of my career and I can foresee the end of my life as well. You know, I'm one of those grand long-term thinkers. And I thought, you know, we've had over 400,000 research papers, and ADHD has been described in medicine going back to 1770 and Melchior Weichert. By the way, in case you wonder who my little icon image is on the Reddit thread, that is a medallion of Melchior Weichert. He is the first person to ever describe adult ADHD. It's in a German medical textbook, and there's a chapter on disorders of attention, which is unbelievable. And in fact, if we're showing books, this is it.
Oh, wow.
This is an original copy sent to me by my German colleague who translated the chapter from German for me, and we published it in a science journal over a decade ago. But amazing. That remains the first reference to ADHD. So it's 200 and what is that? 40, 50 years old at this point, if we think about the history of ADHD in medicine. So, but just to get all of that out of the way, and of course, you've mentioned my other books on executive functioning. I have the giant ADHD handbook for professionals and many other college textbooks.
We did get a couple questions from a professional. Yeah. And so it's good that you have resources.
So I mean, that's all out there as well. So, you know, a lot going on. But thank you very much for mentioning all of that. Even though my mother's no longer alive, to hear that, I'm sure it does her heart well. So that said, where would you like to begin?
Well, I think we covered that. Steph, do you want to take the, is it me or is it ADHD?
Yes, our friends on the Reddit, our questions are often focused around, am I the only one who's experiencing this? So when you posted the AMA, we had people submit a lot of questions, and a bunch of them we selected to go through on this video. So we have some people that are talking about, let's see, where should we start? As a disorder of childhood, is there potential for highly intelligent people with ADHD to not show symptoms during school years, but mask it until they reach a certain stage in their training when it becomes unsustainable anymore?
Yes, it's a qualified yes, but let's just start and say, indeed, that is quite common. First of all, let me just mention, Scott, you were so kind to point that out. ADHD is a lot more than just an attention disorder. And the name does not signify the scope of the cognitive and behavioral issues that people with ADHD struggle with. Indeed, I think it insults them because it trivializes the condition. I call it the Rodney Dangerfield of psychiatry. It gets no respect because the name is awful. It really is a disorder of the brain's executive networks, the executive functions, and those are instrumental to human self-regulation. And human self-regulation is the #1 adaptation by which humans survive on this planet. So you're really looking at a disorder of a major cognitive ability that modern humans possess much more than even earlier variations of humans did going back through evolutionary time. And this is the one that we use to live in groups and socially cooperate and reciprocate and see to our long-term welfare and plan goals. Humans are the only species that contemplates a future. It's a hypothetical future, but they then organize behavior over time toward that future. So what ADHD is disrupting is this whole network of systems that are intended for future-oriented, socially meaningful, and cooperative behavior. And that is what's at risk when these systems become deficient or inconsistent in their functioning. So just to get that out of the way, there's a lot going on under the hood in the mind and brain of people with ADHD that is grossly misrepresented in the trade literature and in the common articles I see in the mainstream trade media that stick with the old DSM view of ADHD as it's just a problem with attention, and maybe you're a little hyperactive, and to some extent maybe you're impulsive or maybe not. And we can get into that too, because there aren't different kinds of ADHD at all. There's only one ADHD, but that leads to another interesting finding. We've discovered a new attention disorder that's masquerading as ADHD, being misdiagnosed as ADHD, but isn't. And perhaps time toward the end we can deal with that if you like. But thank you for pointing that out. And so back to the point about high IQ individuals. What high intelligence does, and we've seen this in our research too, is that it protects people longer in their development from educational failure and even up into graduate work or their employment. So IQ is related to some things in life. And the higher it is, the more protected you might be from your ADHD, because you pick up things very quickly. So even though ADHD makes you less available for learning, your IQ makes you snap it up much more quickly than other people of average ability might be able to do. And so it's not uncommon for the very bright with the disorder to escape our detection much longer into development. And usually bright people come from bright families and bright parents. And those are the parents that would have worked out informal compensatory things, a small private school, maybe Montessori, maybe getting extra curriculum, hiring a tutor. Notice it's all below the professional radar. Nobody engaged the mental health system for a diagnosis. They were just coping with it on the fly. And Scott and Stephanie, as you both know, I'm sure because you're very bright people, is that bright people also tend to discover their own ways to compensate rather than have to receive it as wisdom from a professional. You learn that stuff and you are able to incorporate these compensatory devices into your day without necessarily needing a professional diagnosis to do it. So yet again, here's another protective effect of high intelligence on an individual. But that said, there are aspects of life with which your IQ has nothing to do. And that is things like managing money, driving, living with other people, managing a household, getting along with friends, sexual behavior and risky sexual behavior. And I could go on, but there's a lot of stuff outside of life, many of which is life-threatening, that your IQ does not protect you from. And as a result, what we do when we finally see talented people with ADHD who come in and see us is we have to look outside the traditional pathways to find the impairment that is so essential to making a diagnosis of ADHD, because high symptoms alone don't give you a disorder. It is when those symptoms reach a degree to where adverse consequences and harm are occurring to you, what I call the environment kicks back. And at the point that the environment starts kicking back at you because of the way you're acting or thinking or behaving, that's when disorders begin. So yes, ADHD falls along a spectrum. Yes, there are borderline cases. There are mild cases. There's moderate, there's severe, just like the autism spectrum. But the line where the diagnosis begins starts with harm, adverse consequences racking up to the individual. They are suffering, and it is our job in the professions to relieve that suffering. And we use a diagnosis to help us do that, but the diagnosis is not the end of the process. It's the beginning of that process. So all that said, the questioner is absolutely right. The brighter people struggle with the disorder longer. They're not believed. Nobody can think that they got as far as they did and have ADHD, and therefore it's dismissed or trivialized, or just go to Starbucks and get a coffee or get a good night's sleep, take a little omega-3 6 oil, just do something trivial, none of which, by the way, works. But the issue here then is they will eventually crash. It just takes longer for that crash to happen. It might be college, where we find that only about 10% of people with ADHD can complete a college program
Wow.
versus 40% of the population. And it has nothing to do with brilliance, intelligence, or knowledge. It's the demands that college makes on executive functioning and self-regulation are enormous. And unless they get special help at college, they're usually out within 1 to 2 semesters. They just
Wow.
can't handle the demands. So, they may even go further. I have physicians that we've talked to. There are professional athletes. There are lawyers.
Yeah.
There are politicians.
This man has a PhD. He managed
Yes.
to do it with
And
ADHD.
I only
Right.
crashed after, like when I was
Yeah.
like 2-3 years into my professional career, like I got my PhD. I was like, hey, great, clearly I'm fine. And then I got 9 to 5. Oh,
Sure. No.
Yeah,
for the
and
two
then,
of
and then
us-
reality hits. Yeah.
For the
Yeah.
two of us, we made it through university, and the problems didn't really start reaching the harm level until we entered the workforce,
Oh, yeah.
which is when it became unsustainable, and we had to reevaluate why is all of this happening.
Well, especially if you like what you're studying, and I think, Scott, you told me
Exactly.
you did, it's a lot easier to engage something that you're interested in.
Yeah.
The problem with typical life is after you graduate and move into the true world out there, the working world, 80% of what you're doing is scut work. But it's
Yes.
important scut work, because if you don't get it done, the delayed consequences of not staying on top of the routine demands of your job, of which only about 20% are really interesting or engaging, can be absolute failure. I mean, you get fired because you're late, you're not
Yep.
organized, you can't make meetings, you don't follow through on what your boss asks you to do. So to me, it's the boredom of life that is so necessary that all of us have to deal with, whether it's managing a home, managing a budget, handling tasks at work, balancing all of our friendships. If you have ADHD, you're running around spinning plates, and eventually they start to crash. So the working world can really bite you if you have this disorder. And because a lot of it is time sensitive, boring, but essential.
yeah.
And boy, that's what people with ADHD just don't handle very well. As you know, I call adult ADHD time blindness, because it's the worst disorder in our field for a person to have and manage themselves to time. It's almost impossible. I mean, you talk to adults and they say, I don't know what this thing is you call time, but I don't get it. I mean, I can't deal with it. I don't sense it. I don't feel it.
Yep.
And when that happens, you're kind of like a 5-year-old waiting for Christmas. Everything feels like it takes longer than it really does. And so you think you have a lot of time that you never had. And so you don't invest the time, and all of a sudden the deadline's upon you, and it's like, oh damn, is it here already? And you're not even half prepared for it. And that's all related to the brain's timing circuits and how they disrupt it. But what people don't understand is the older you get, the more time sensitive our life becomes, the more demands are anchored around the process of time. Look at time management, look at calendars, look at Outlook, look at everything in our life is around time. And now you can see why ADHD is more impairing in adults than it is in children. Even if the symptoms might be getting a little better, the impairments are getting much, much worse because of the demands that life places upon an adult. And one of those is time.
My crash really started happening when I had a child, right? I had my son, and then suddenly my priorities were like my kid, and then work, and then like myself. And this I lost the ability to do that. And I got sucked into, video games were a big thing for me. That was kind of my problem. And it still is, very much so.
Yeah.
For many people on our subreddit as well.
Yeah,
Like, why can you spend hours playing video games? Because it gives you immediate consequences and rewards.
That's right. That's right. And life is not a video game. If it was, we would end the Reddit. So, but it's not like that. And unfortunately, that difference between video games and real life tells us that it's an executive disorder, because one of them demands a lot of self-motivation. As you pointed out, the fuel tank of future-directed behavior is self-motivation. And video games don't require that. They embed the reinforcement in the software.
The point of performance.
That's right. Which is why up to 25% of young adults with ADHD have an internet addiction, mostly for gaming. I mean, they do qualify as truly addicted in their behavior. So, that becomes a rising concern, as you point out, particularly when it is displacing all of the other productive self-caring things we all have to be doing, taking care of our health, our hygiene, our welfare, our money, our responsibilities, our family, and all of this is getting jettisoned relative to this highly addictive high tech that people are engaging that can't disengage from it very well.